Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri. During the season, we examine the paths to crowning an ultimate survivor in each year's college football playoff championship. And in the offseason, we broaden our topics a little bit. But more than anything, I wanted to welcome back my great co-host, Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports, and you dad. Welcome back.
Thanks, man. It's been quite a time. It's been quite a couple of weeks. I think that she's 2.5 weeks old at this point, and I don't really remember life from before it. It feels like she's just always existed. So we're having a great time, sleeping a little less than we used to, but it's been great, man. It's been great.
Yeah, nothing like a child, especially a newborn, to help you realize how little sleep you actually need to operate on a somewhat healthy basis. So I've been there, and I'm sure many of the folks listening have as well. It almost feels like, the way you described it made me think about it, like not remembering what it was like before. It's like the adult version of that first semester, that first week at college during orientation, where it's like you get there, you arrive, and then you can't even remember what it was like not being at college. This is like the way more serious version of that. After a couple of weeks, you're like, I don't remember a time when there wasn't this child in my life. And that's wonderful. That's great. I mean, and I'm glad you're able to take some time to do this. I mean, it's tough. It's tough on the spouse. It's tough on luckily, I know you have a support network, so that's really great. What has struck you the most about being a new father? Any surprises for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wouldn't say that anything's been especially surprising. I think that what's just most interesting and surprising about being a dad is just like the actual feelings and process of going through it. Like you hear about what it's like, and it's mostly what you expect, but it's like, I think back to like when we went into labor and when my wife like gave the baby. It's like, it is one of the things that's really funny, especially about that time, is it's at times just like so awkward for the dad because you're just kind of there. Like you kind of don't have anything to be doing. You don't have like a task right there. And I think that a lot of men are very task oriented. So for me, we actually did an inducement so we had to be there like all day waiting for basically my wife to get to the point where she could give birth. And I was like stressing the hell out because I was just sitting in a dark room for like 12 hours. Like, what do I do with my hands? So that's honestly been the thing that's been kind of funny. Is just like trying to figure out where can you help as a dad? Where can you not help? How can you do it? The other part too that's been kind of interesting to me is like the turnaround between needing to like do things with the baby is so quick because like basically you feed them and like it's like 2 hours until they need to be fed again. And so it's like, what can you actually accomplish in that amount of time? Like, can you really read? Can you really like, I don't know, like I can't go anywhere. So it's just, that's definitely been the piece that we're trying to figure out right now is like, how do I do productive things in between the times? And, we're reaching an equilibrium. It's obviously nice that both me and my wife are at home right now. And so we're able to kind of work through that and take turns. But yeah, it's relentless, man. It's nonstop.
You brought up something that made me realize, for those listening that, some of you who've had kids who are listening will know what I'm talking about. But if you have friends who are having kids before you do, nothing is more welcome than being the person that's willing to hang out with them when they finally are able to start hanging out with their friends again. Because as John's saying, you don't do that for a while. You're too busy. Like, no, I got to be near the baby. I got to be around that. But one day, and you're feeling it calm down as the weeks pass, you're going to be able to go out, and then it's so fun. And then your friends, you see them again. You kind of emerge. Some of them might come over and bring a meal or do something nice like that. No, that's always welcome as well. But I remember how nice it was to finally go out again. And even then, I think for a while there, was just like only one of us would go out at a time, because it didn't feel right if one of the parents wasn't there. But then to just be able to go out like as a couple and see your friends again is just like I remember that moment, and it's so exciting. And then maybe another moment where you bring the kid out, and the first time you take your kid out for nothing that isn't like a doctor's appointment, a wellness baby check or whatever, it's just kind of like you're like, oh, can I do this? Can I get this right? You got you got the bassinet or whatever the heck, and you're kind of going around. Oh, I remember all of those moments. It's a rite of passage for so many of us. But the good news is I tell people, and you're very obviously clearly you're okay with it right now. But I always tell people like in moments of panic, just remember like billions of these have been born, and it seems to work. We got a system. The system has been with it. It can work. Just be patient. Babies are resilient.
I know some dumb people who have kids and they manage to keep their kids alive through infancy. So you know what? Like if they can do it, I feel pretty okay about it. No, but it is funny because you do just get to a point, and I already feel it because it's funny. I'm like the first of like my generation of cousins to have kids, so like I haven't been around a lot of like kids or babies or all that sort of stuff very much in a very long time. And so like I probably hadn't held a newborn, I mean, like as an adult, like I don't know if I ever have. But like you just kind of do it, and then it's like, oh, that wasn't that bad. That wasn't that hard. Oh, okay, she's fine. You can leave her for a second. It's fine. She's not gonna like freak out. She's not gonna whatever. And so I think that just getting to that point helps you kind of be like, all right, it's probably okay. Oh, she's kind of tossing and turning over there. It's probably fine. You can probably
Yeah.
so once you just go through a couple days of it, and again, she was born on January 19th, so I guess she's like 19 days old or something like that right now. Like I already am like, all right, she's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. That's a healthy approach to it because again, like sometimes, there's moments where you're stressed. You can put the kid down for a few. I always tell new parents, I'm not, and again, I'm not specifically talking to you about this, but I always tell like when I teach, I'm like, because I got kids like in college, so they usually haven't had kids yet. And I was telling them like, look, there'll be a moment where you might be just like, I can't handle this. That's fine. Put the baby down. Let them cry for a little bit. They'll be all right. They won't remember, and then pick them up when you had a breather and then everything goes well. So yeah, it's fun. These are great times. I mean, it slow during those weeks, but man, does it in the retrospect does it fly by? It flies by so quickly. There's so much of that I look back on that was wonderful. So much that wasn't wonderful. That was more of a chore, if anything. But yeah, you enjoy these moments. I always say, like, especially sounds like your daughter is being pretty decent. Nothing too extreme. Pretty relaxed. Pretty chill, huh?
Yeah, it hasn't been too bad. Thankfully, she doesn't cry that much, honestly, and like she is very targeted when she does cry, and she really doesn't like scream her head off very often. She more kind of like will just be like, "Hey, just a heads up, like I need to eat now." And actually, the first couple of days we were a little worried because she wasn't crying all that much, and we were like, "Is everything okay?" She's definitely started crying more now, but again, it's very like, all right, it's been 3 hours, time to get a move on. And so she's very direct, she's very to the point, and we appreciate her for it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've heard that term like for a child like that as an angel baby because then you're like, I'm gonna have another one, and then you find out it isn't nurtured. There's a lot of nature there too. Spin that wheel. Like it's the Price is Right. You're two hand pulling it down, boop, 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 and then you get the colicky nightmare of a child. That ends up being great when they're older, but you're just sort of like, what have I done? I've got a toddler and a baby that never wants to sleep. Goodness. Well, I don't want to. We can talk about this for ages, and I know that gets me a bit. But I want to. We thought this would be kind of a fun opportunity to talk about parents in the sport. So, because football being what it is, fathers and sons who tend to coach, including there might even be a grandson or two in there that we could mention as well. Before we jump into that, just a quick reminder, you can always find us here on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, listen to your feedback, get a moment, take a second to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. We enjoy the reviews, and if they're good, we'll probably talk about them here. But moving on to sort of the topic at hand, I love the idea. You're like, hey, should we do something about fathers and sons? I'm like, yeah, let's do that. That sounds like a great idea. There's so much of that going on because we both, as we were kind of talking about before the show, doing research for this, you kind of realize this isn't a struggle to find topics. This is like an editing project. Like, who do I even pick from the assortment? Which I don't know. I'm not going to say I'm like, wow, nepotism is rampant. No, but no, it's just like there's a lot of folks who you see what your parent does and you kind of want to do that. You grow up around it. You always read a lot about that, like coaches who, my dad was a coach, so I was hanging around coaches all the time and I got really into it. You hear that in all kinds of professions, business, law, engineering, medicine, people who just are used to seeing a parent do something. And that's something they feel like they could do as well. But let's kind of go into that. How do you envision this conversation going? What obviously being a new father, but what kind of brought you to this kind of discussion?
Yeah, and just to kind of take a step back. So my thoughts was, obviously it's my first show back after being a new dad. And so I thought that we should look at fathers, and in college football, it's going to mostly be sons. I don't know that I have obviously a daughter on my list, unfortunately, but who are some of the best fathers and sons? And we're kind of in a moment right now where there's a lot of fathers and sons in this industry, whether it's players, of course, whether it's coaches, whether it's administrators. I mean, even if we really wanted to get into the weeds, we can get into like the strength coaches. Like, I mean, actually, one great example would be, Baylor linebacker a couple years ago, all Big 12 player, Dylan Doyle, son of Chris Doyle, the former Iowa strength coach, right? Like, we are in a place right now where like you said, it's not necessarily that it's like nepotistic, but like where this industry and where college football is really compounding on itself. And so many of the same families are putting more kids into college football as well. There's actually a couple on this list where I think that you could have multiple sons mentioned. I tried to narrow it down to one specific son and one specific father for the most part, but we'll certainly give mention to some of the other sons who might be relevant on this list as well. So I'm excited for this. And the other part of this too is that, like you said, when you started looking and researching, it's amazing the amount of connections that people have at this point. There are a couple that I was like, oh my gosh, this would be a great one, but that's a nephew. Oh no, I can't include that one. Or, oh, this one's like, something like that. One that came to mind is new Mississippi State athletic director, Zach Selman, is the nephew of Leroy Selman, the great Oklahoma player. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that would have been perfect to get an administrator and a Hall of Famer as a player on the same list. Unfortunately, he's not eligible, but there are plenty of others that I think are going to be a lot of fun to talk about.
The one that talking about people, you're like, oh, I should include them, and then you realize, oh, they're not actually related, or they're not related the same as. A lot of people make the mistake of assuming Eddie Robinson Jr., the head coach of Alabama State, is the son of the legendary Grambling head coach Eddie Robinson, but they're not related.
What? So, that's news to me.
Yeah, no, I was like, because I kept reading around, I'm like, why don't they mention the son? Why don't they mention the father? And then finally, I found the article that said, like, no, they're not actually related. I'm like, oh. Man, that must come up a lot. I mean, you kind of like, you can imagine how many awkward media questions come up, or just fans and like, what's your dad like? Well, my dad is not the guy you're thinking of, but okay, thank you.
Well, that's funny too, because I have met several times other members of like the Eddie Robinson family, and they are a junior, the third, the fourth kind of family.
Yeah, his father always shows up for the award.
Yeah,
his son always shows up for the award that's named after his dad, because I've met him there.
That's so funny.
So that's the confusion. I'm like, wait, he doesn't look like the guy I met. When you look up the picture of the Alabama State head coach, and you're like, oh my gosh, boy, that's awkward. Like, because you imagine, like, because it's not, again, it's just so many things. It's the chance of your name being so similar. I mean, we don't say the same thing about guys with the last name Smith necessarily, but that one is just kind of like, oh, okay.
Well, it's an HBCU coach named Eddie Robinson. Like, it's an understandable mistake to make.
Yeah, exactly. It's understandable. It is, given all the context clues, you might go in that direction. But let's see. So how should we kick this off? Should we talk with the obvious? Because there's a couple of names out there that are very prominent right now. Who would you like to kick off with?
So well, let's figure out who's picking what. Okay. So why don't you go first? Okay. So you get first pick, I'll get second pick, and we'll just go back and forth and try to make the best team that we can.
Yeah, all right. I love it. No, so my approach was I was willing to kind of look at like I jokingly started to write these out like they were members of the Game of Thrones or royalty, like house something. So I felt the way to kick it off was House Harbaugh, because they are right now the premier college football family in this moment in time. With, obviously, you start with the father, Jack Harbaugh, who was a championship coach at Western Kentucky when it was an FCS championship in 2002, which I believe is when he decided to retire. I think he was like, all right, I did it, I'm done. Got his son, obviously, Jim Harbaugh, who is now a college football national champion, but also very successful in his previous stops at San Diego and Stanford and the 49ers, getting the Super Bowl and losing to his brother, John, who we also should mention, only because he's also been a Super Bowl champ and is an NFL head coach. But sticking with college, there's a grandson involved, because you got Jay Harbaugh, who's also kind of, he's now following his father to the Chargers, but was also with with Michigan for the last several years. So I thought they would be a good family to start out with, only because you get that rare third generation who's at least far enough in his career where it isn't like a graduate assistant. It's like, no, they're all in their careers at this point. And I thought they're no better team to sort of start out with, or team, no better family to start out with, if you're talking about the father-son relationships and coaching.
Yeah, well, obviously, my fatherhood journey kind of started this conversation, but I think that the Harbaugh thing is the thing that really tied it together, right? That really made this a relevant topic. Obviously, Jim Harbaugh winning a national championship, becoming the third member of his family to win a championship, like you mentioned, and second at the collegiate level. I mean, as coaches, like they are like in football right now, they are the first family of coaching, with obviously Jim, what he accomplished at Michigan, what he accomplished with the 49ers. Now he's with the Los Angeles Chargers. You look at John with a Super Bowl under his belt. He was in the AFC Championship game this year. They have another great team coming back next year. The one thing that's sad about this is that we can't get another Harbaugh Super Bowl because they're both in the AFC now. I feel like Jim should have thought about that before he took the Chargers job. But unfortunately, we'll only get that in the AFC title game. And also, unfortunately, Patrick Mahomes exists, so they probably won't be making many Super Bowls. But anyway, this is one of the great coaching families. And I think that if you're just looking at coaching alone, I think that this has a really good case to be, number one on the board. And then I think you also have to factor in the fact that Jim was a great college player who was one of the most successful Michigan quarterbacks of the 80s. So I like this pick overall. This is not who I would have gone number one overall, but I think that they probably would have gone number two for me.
Okay, who's your number one?
My number one, I'm going with the Mannings. And of course, they're probably better known for their NFL success, but this is an all-time college football family as well. And you do also have the grandson factoring in now with Arch Manning. The one thing, I don't really count him as part of that because he's Cooper's son, who wasn't really part of this whole thing. But when you talk about Archie, SEC Player of the Year, his numbers retired over at Ole Miss. He's considered an all-time great over there. He's in the Hall of Fame. Peyton comes through. He's a Heisman finalist. He's an All-American. He's a College Football Hall of Famer, considered one of the best players of all time. And then Eli comes through, and he also is SEC Offensive Player of the Year. They split up the award from being SEC Player of the Year to SEC Offensive Player of the Year at that point. But three all-time great college quarterbacks. They ended up retiring Eli's number as well. Peyton's number is retired at Tennessee. I mean, when you're talking about quarterbacking, this is the first family of quarterbacking. This is the greatest run of college quarterbacks from one family that we've ever seen. We'll see whether Arch can add to the list eventually. But, even I think factoring him in as the number one overall recruit in the class of 2023, I think that even that's relevant to me. That's, when you talk about even just as a recruit and coming to Texas, I think that even factors in as well. So for me, they are the first family of football right now in college football. I think that you look historically. I mean, I pulled up for research, I pulled up ESPN's list of the 150 greatest players of 150 years of college football. They're, Archie and Peyton are both top 50 players. They're the only family members to be top 50 players on that list. And of course, they went on to have great success in the NFL as well. Although I will say, and this is not like this is just such an indicator of how football has changed and how quarterbacking especially has changed over the past 70 years or whatever. Archie Manning has a 125 to 173 touchdown to interception ratio as a passer, which is just deeply funny. Again, not relevant to like whether he was good as a player, but it's just very funny that that was just fine back in the day. And then obviously you look at Peyton and Eli's numbers and they're just so dumb at the NFL level. And NFL is not why I'm picking this, but they are both also all-time college quarterbacks.
I like the direction you took this, because if we're talking about college football, royalty, or just in terms of things, I admit I leaned a little on the coach administration side, but there is a coaching family that I have to bring up, and that's the Bowdens. I mean, starting with Bobby, just an incredible run, especially when he was at Florida State with national championships, a dynasty, making that team what it was, from being kind of an irrelevant afterthought that was better known as had a couple of famous alumni like Lee Corso as a player, and oh my gosh, I forgot his name. The Bandit, Smokey the Bandit. Oh my gosh, he was roommates with Lee Corso, the actor. Oh goodness, I am gonna I'll get back to that in a second, because that's me. My brain, I'm a visual person, so I tend to forget names. But then let's go really quick though. The Suns, Tommy Bowden. Now, granted, I feel bad for Tommy Bowden, because I think history is going to more remember him as the guy who preceded Dabo Swinney at Clemson for all those years and was doing fine at Clemson, but they just couldn't quite get over the hill. It's sort of like, yeah. So, and then, but at the same time, he had that incredible year at Tulane where he had that incredible season at Tulane. And then his brother Terry, who again had that undefeated season at Auburn, which was kind of hamstrung by the fact that previously they had the sanctions that didn't allow them to actually play in a bowl game, so they had no shot at winning a title. And then he's been, a head coach at several other schools since then. Most recently, was he most recently ULM or most recently Akron? I can never even remember where ULM. But right now I'm not sure where he's at. And then of course, there's a third brother, Jeff, who's also been a college assistant over the years. So I think if we're talking again, families, especially who've been very college football heavy, the Bowdens, House Bowden, however you want to look at it, deserve inclusion for just the performance of all of them. Particularly, obviously, Bobby, and then the early careers of Tommy and Terry, most certainly.
So I was completely unaware. You're thinking of Burt Reynolds, and
That's it. Oh my God.
I was completely unaware that Burt Reynolds played college football with Lee Corso at Florida State. I did not know that information, which is why I was blank in the face when you were talking about that. That is an incredible story. I'm sure that to a lot of our listeners, that's more common knowledge, but I did not know that. That's really funny.
The problem is Burt Reynolds aged like fine wine in terms of appearance, and I mean, he was a Hollywood actor. Even the men get surgery here and there, and they just don't really talk about it, right? So I think that was part of the reason why. And Lee just looks like a guy who's been in the sun all day being a head coach, So I mean, it's a slightly different lifestyle in terms of that stuff. So yeah, no, they. And I remember when Burt Reynolds passed away, they were a few years later. They did the big estate sale that was much ballyhooed, and I was tempted to buy. I think he had it was like a Sun Bowl MVP, or something like that was in the lot. And it was the most generic looking trophy you've ever seen. Clearly someone at the Sun Bowl or whatever it was just drove up to the local trophy shop and asked for this thing. I don't even remember if it had his name on it, but I was like, I don't even know if it was real, to be honest. But I was just like, I was halfway tempted to put a couple $100 to say I had that, because it was such an odd thing, piece of college football memorabilia.
I probably would have thought about it. That's pretty fun. But no, to talk about the Bowdens, I think that, like you said, they are probably the most well-known name in coaching. I think the thing that held it back a little bit for me is that Bobby just carries the list so much, right? Like what he did is just a completely different level. But I think that the Suns, for not being Bobby, did get a little underrated. Like Terry was very good for a long time. And by the way, Terry was recently the head coach at Louisiana Monroe. He just got let go this past year, but he was coaching up until this past year as well. And like you said, Jeff Bowden, a good assistant for a long time on those Florida State teams as well. So I mean, I think it's a very solid group. It's a very solid list, and yeah, they would have probably been my next pick if I had the next pick. But since I didn't, let's go ahead and move on to my next pick. So I picked a player with my first group. I'm trying to figure out if I should try to then go coach, but I don't know. I tried to because there's so many coaches, like you mentioned, so many coaching families on this list. So I tried to err a little away from the coaches and a little more towards the players. Hey, I'll find a combo right now. How about that? Deion Sanders and Shador Sanders as next on my list. Now, look, Deion is a all-time, college football player, all time, but has obviously been good, as an HBCU coach too. We'll see if he's a good coach at Colorado long term. Whatever you want to say about what Colorado struggled with last year, Shador is a really good player, and you can throw Shiloh Sanders also onto the list as a defensive back. He's an all right player. I don't think that he's necessarily in that tier, but I think that Shador does belong in sort of that conversation of really good players. I think that he has a chance to be a first round pick next year if he's able to put together a slightly better season, and especially if they're able to maybe be competitive for a bowl game. And I mean, Deion speaks for himself. He's one of like the 10 greatest football players of all time. I think you could make the case, and one of the, probably 25 best college football players of all time. And so I think that he's a very obvious inclusion on the list. Again, you look at you, I have my like big board up here and I'm looking like, man, there's a lot of good players on this list. I feel like I want to include, but I think that the Sanders are next on my list.
I think that's a good inclusion. It's a current. I mean, obviously they're very timely, they're very topical, but I think they're very defensible because of that reason. I mean, the talent of Shador is you just kind of if he was coaching on if he was playing on a team that was loaded, like if you threw him on Georgia, like imagine where he'd be at. And what he's doing at Colorado, there's still a lot of opportunity. I mean, probably have a whole other conversation about how, especially after the spring transfer window, what Colorado's even going to look like next season. But yeah, no, absolutely, I think that's a great call. And I am absolutely willing to still defend Deion's capability as a coach, because again, Colorado was in a dire situation when he took over, and I do agree with the concept of that he was a sports person of the year only because of the sheer splash he made, which was remarkable and unlike anything college football has ever seen. Period. If we're another family I wanted to bring up, and this one I'm going to actually add some, even though they're not blood relatives, they're kind of a bonus connection here. And that is the Stoops family, because you actually start with a high school coach, which is a little odd, but he's so important to all of this. And that's Ron Stoops Sr., who died young of I believe it was a heart attack, as I recall. He was a head coach of Cardinal Mooney High School. And I mention that only because that is what motivated his one of his not even his oldest son, but Bob Stoops, to retire when he did from Oklahoma and kind of pass the reins over to Lincoln Riley at the time. But he had four sons who've all become coaches. The oldest, Ron Stoops Jr., always kind of was happy, and there's good interviews with him if you look him up, where he always was happy sort of being an assistant to either his father or then to his brothers at their various stops. He was the one that went to Youngstown State and became a teacher by training, because that's what his dad did. And then the younger three brothers, Bob, Mike, and Mark, ended up being, they were arguably better as players. All three of them played for Iowa. And then obviously all three of them became head coaches. Bob Stoops, notably at Oklahoma, where he won a national championship. Mike Stoops at Arizona and has been an assistant since. And then Mark Stoops, the current head coach of Kentucky. Now I'm going to throw in a slight bonus here, because that same group, the same peers, the same teams also generated Carl Pelini and Bo Pelini, both of whom have been head coaches. Carl was briefly at FAU's head coach and is an assistant. And Bo Pelini, of course, was the head coach of Nebraska and Youngstown State, which is where they were all growing up, although they both went to different schools. Carl went to Columbia because he's apparently an Ivy League man, and Bo, of course, went to Ohio
the Pelini's Ivy League people, of course.
When I think of they're an interesting group, and I've actually talked to one of. I did an interview once with Bo and his son. They were putting together some kind of a show of their own, and it was a good interview. But yeah, he's a much more reserved person, Bo is, when you talk to him. But I will always have a warm spot for Bo Pelini because he was willing to go in that spring game, coming onto the field, holding up a cat like the Lion King as a reference to the faux Pelini thing that was taking off. Like, the fact that he was willing to do that, the fact that this is now in this current era of college football, I would not be shocked to see a head coach kind of like have a little bit of fun, be a little silly. But this was before any of it. This was like, did this just happen? Like, this is like an internet moment. And that moment where the so-called serious head coaches of yesteryear started to actually reveal a little bit of good humor. So that'll always be a soft spot for me. But going back, I'm going to just say really primarily, though, you have to mention Stoops brothers and that entire family tree.
No, I think it's a great inclusion. The oldest brother, by the way, Ron Jr., did spend some time as a college assistant at Youngstown State. And so he doesn't deserve inclusion. And the other thing, too, if you want to make it generational, is Oklahoma's best receiver last year was Drake Stoops, who is Bob's son. So you can definitely include him on the list. I think he's going to have a chance to try and stick in the NFL a little bit. He's just like, I hate to use all the white stereotype words for a wide receiver, but he is just like such a crafty player. Like, he is just somebody who knows how to find creases in defenses, and so he was a high possession guy for Oklahoma the past couple of years. So he's like a legitimately good college football player who does deserve mention on the list, even though he came to Oklahoma as a walk-on. So I think that you can also throw so you got Ron Sr., you got all four brothers, all four of the Stoops brothers coach college football. And then you've got Drake Stoops now as a college player. And also, by the way, Drake's twin brother, I can't remember his name right now, also spent some time as an analyst on Oklahoma's staff as well, because Drake Stoops is also so old that his brother has already graduated and been an analyst. But that's a whole other conversation about college football in 2023. But I like the inclusion quite a bit. They actually, I didn't necessarily make the connection with them as a father-son duo, but like I said, I mean, like, Ron Sr. was a significant, I think like a significant person. Isaac Stoops, Joey mentioned. Thank you so much to our producer, Joey. And so they are a 3-generational family as football coaches and people who impacted college football, even if Ron Sr. wasn't an active college football coach. So I like that fit quite a bit. Where to go now? This is where things start to get kind of fun. I think that for me, I had a top 4, and it was the Mannings, the Bowdens, the Sanders, and the Harbaughs. And I think that once you get past that, you're kind of in free-for-all land just a little bit. So I'm going to go with a kind of a very interesting college football family. I'm going to go with the McCaffreys, and primarily Ed McCaffrey, the former Denver Broncos wide receiver, the former Stanford receiver. I believe he's in Stanford's Hall of Honor as a wide receiver. He was top 5 all time in Stanford receiving yards for a long time. Went on to have a really good college career. And he also was a head coach at Northern Colorado, although he was kind of fired a little bit in disgrace. I don't know if that necessarily helps his case. But by the way, guys, his son is Christian McCaffrey, a really, 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 really good college football player who was a Heisman finalist, should have won the Heisman. I think you can make a pretty good case that year. So broke the all-time all-purpose yards record in his final year on campus. And the other thing, too, is that I think I kind of made mention earlier. They have another son, Luke McCaffrey, who played wide receiver at Rice these past couple of years. And he was kind of awesome. The last 2 years, he had just about 1,600 receiving yards. I think that he absolutely has a chance to be an NFL draft pick and maybe even stick around in the NFL. But he was also, I mean, and again, this is not an NFL program. That's not what we're caring about. But he was like an all-Conference USA, all-AAC type of player as well. So to have those 3 on the board, I mean, that's a great group. And like I said, what happens in the NFL doesn't necessarily factor into the list, but watching what Ed and Christian did, I mean, that's a pretty good endorsement of their talents.
I'm going to throw out a very kind of someone who isn't as expected. It's a current head coach and his father, and that's Willie Fritz, because Willie Fritz is
Ooh.
obviously a massively talented head coach. I've been a big booster for him ever since Georgia Southern hired him, because he'd previously had very successful runs at Blinn, which is a junior college, Central Missouri, in D2, Sam Houston State, Georgia Southern, which he was there for the transition to FBS, and then obviously Tulane in Houston, and he's won several national championships, especially at the junior college level. And so he's been successful wherever he's been. But I remember when I had an opportunity a few years ago to interview him, I was blown away by his father, because his he died, unfortunately, a while ago. Like, he died at age 67 in 1987. But Harry Fritz was a coach he was a classic old school coach. Like, he coached football for a year, he coached basketball, he coached baseball, and he was an athletic director for 3 different universities. But and he was at one point the director of the NAIA, which is that smaller association that is a rival of the NCAA. But what people don't realize is he was one of the people that designed women's intercollegiate sports. I mean, I'm not even understating it. He's one of the reasons why there's women's intercollegiate sports. One of his daughters was also a college swimmer, and he wanted to kind of help that. He was motivated to do that. So the NCAA adding women's sports was the direction of that came from Willie Fritz's dad, Harry. So he's one of these hidden, I wouldn't say hidden figure, because he's a very successful white man, but but at the same time, he was out there doing this work. And especially last 2 years ago now it's 2 years ago with the anniversary of Title IX. They were kind of looking back at some of the folks who had been part of that. And again, Willie Fritz's dad was part of that, in addition to being, so that's, both of them were involved in college football, but their greater impact, pound for pound, it's hard to say, like, yeah, I helped create, my dad created women's intercollegiate sports. That it's a little bit of a huge one, and one that I think is a bit underrated in the greater picture of impact of father sons in intercollegiate sports.
So the only complaint that I have with you making this pick is that you could have gotten that further down the board, because that is an awesome pick, and I would not have thought of that connection. That is really cool to learn about Harry Fritz. I'm gonna have to do some research into him once we get off of this show, because I love also. I tried to have a couple of administrator ties on the show too, but that's probably the best administrator tie that I've heard. So good pick by you, but again, could have gotten it further down the board, I think. I'm gonna go. Man, I really am leaning on player combos right now, aren't I? This wasn't purposeful, but like I feel like got some really good player combos. I'm gonna go with the Greasy family. Bob Greasy, the former Purdue quarterback, considered one of the best college football players of all time. Uh, won every award that there was except for the Heisman, basically, back in the 1960s. Won the Sammy Baugh Trophy, Big Ten Player of the Year, consensus All-American. And then his son, Brian Greasy, was the quarterback who quarterbacked Michigan to its previously most recent national title in 1997. Also a really good player, an all Big Ten type player as a quarterback as well. So I think that when you look at the combination of Bob Greasy's excellence as an individual player and Brian Greasy's importance to the University of Michigan for a very long time. He's also, by the way, the MVP of the Rose Bowl, which was the game that ultimately gave them the national championship. He's in the Rose Bowl Hall of Fame. He was an all Big Ten first team quarterback as well. So he wasn't an All-American necessarily, but I think that he was a very, very good player who was important. In some ways, I think you probably could compare him a little bit to what J.J. McCarthy was for Michigan this past year. So I think two very important Big Ten legends and two of the most important Big Ten players of the last little while in college football.
That's a good one. I am going to actually go with another coaching family, but at a different division, but is so notable. Even if you don't know the name, you know the team. And that is Larry Karras and his family at Mount Union.
That's
So
a good
Larry
one.
Karras, for those who
That's
don't
a good
know,
one.
for those who don't know D3, there was a whole 12 years where all but one title game included just 2 teams. Like both teams won them all. Like, and that was Whitewater under, of course, current Kansas head coach Lance Leipold, but also Mount Union under his rival Larry Karras, who won again 11 titles over his tenure, not just in that window, but over his tenure, retired with his 11th national championship, and then just told his AD, you know what, my son Vince, who'd been on the staff and was also he also, like all of his families, played for Mount Union in their collegiate years. He took over as head coach, won 3 titles, and now Vince Carrius is actually working for Candle over at Toledo. He's the defensive coordinator there, and clearly talented at what they do in Toledo, because they're always up for another gig. I don't know why why Jason Candle still hasn't been hired and is still at Toledo. Well, that's a whole other question. We'll sidestep that. But here's the best part. So when he stepped away, his brother-in-law is now the current head coach of Mount Union. So technically still a part of the family tree, just married to the daughter of Larry. So the current head coach, Jeff Dart, is actually the father, probably the son-in-law of Larry. So it's an interesting family. One of the nephews is a head coach at some level. I forgot, has been a head coach at some level. Eric Rayburn. I don't have that in front of me off the top of my head, but so that's another family. I'm thought not Division I, not even Division II, but they are absolutely their impact at the Division III level. Just ask anybody who's been involved in Division III during that particular run. They were unmistakable, and they dominated their level of collegiate sport.
Yeah, that is such a good pick. That is such a ridiculously good pick. People need to understand what this Mount Union thing is. It is, there's nothing quite like it at really any level of college football, not just necessarily the success. I mean, other places have had success, but just the way they do things has bled into college football at every level. I mean, you talk about Mount Union. This is a program that put Pierre Garçon into the NFL, that put Cecil Shorts into the NFL from Division III. That is so dumb. That should not happen, but they did it. This is a non-scholarship level of football. And when you talk about coaches who have come through there, you mentioned the Toledo guys, Jason Candle, Matt Campbell also played and coached at Mount Union. Nick Sirianni came through Mount Union as well. I know that he's not the hottest name right now, nor is Alex Grinch. But again, for Alex Grinch to be a Division III guy, to go up through the system and obviously have success at the Power 5 level, I mean, it's Mount Union is one of the great kind of producers of coaching talent that we have at any level, and the Karras family is right at the center of it. So that is a really good pick. I honestly am starting
I wanted to add one thing before I forgot. I just looked up Eric Rayburn because my note didn't make sense. It's like coach at many teams. So they're all lower division teams, but he was at he was head coach at Wabash, pardon me, the D3 all men's school. Then he was at Savannah State in that brief period where they were FCS. And now he's been at Gannon. He's been their head coach since, which is a D2 team out in Erie, Pennsylvania, which I visited once, so yeah, that is, again, that's just the family. And I love the fact that you mentioned the coaching tree of former players is absolutely it punches way above its weight for a Division III school.
Yeah, I'm starting to get a little mad because you're taking me to the cleaners with this inside college football stuff, and that's usually my purview. So I do not feel prepared. I'm blaming. You
got baby on the brain, baby. You got baby on the brain. That's it.
I love it. I love it. So I love those picks. I'm gonna still stick with players. I don't know. I just have a lot of players on my list. I'm gonna go with 2 players with the same name. Marvin Harrison Sr. and Jr. Marvin Harrison Sr. played at Syracuse, was an All-American receiver, had 1,100 receiving yards at a time when people didn't really have 1,100 receiving yards. And Marvin Harrison Jr. obviously was what he was this year. I do think that he was a little overhyped as a college player. I think that he was extremely good, but I think he projects even better as an NFL player at the next level. But he won the Biletnikoff. He was a first-team All-American, no question about it, right? He was one of the 2 or 3 best receivers in college football each of the last 2 years. That's the floor for what he is an awesome player. And obviously, I think that when you talk about 2 All-American receivers, you talk about one of the best receiving pairings that I think that you can make in college football over the past 25 or 30 years. So I think that they deserve mention on this list.
I think that's a good one. I love it because you're going very player heavy and I'm going coach heavy. And I'm thinking now of a coach who got a little bit of heat for having his son originally as a player for him. and that is Dan Hawkins and his son Cody. Now, I have a big, big, big soft spot for Coach Hawkins, Dan Hawkins, I should say, because he was absolutely fantastic at Boise State. Before that, he was at Willamette, which is a D3 school in Oregon. And by the way, when we talk about dynasties, a striking number are from the Northwest and California that people don't even think about, and even the mountain states. But so he ended up taking the job after, because for those who may not be remember, a lot of people who are more, I don't want to say it like in an insulting way because it's been so much time. People associate Chris Peterson with Boise State being successful, and that is true. He was there at the peak. But Dan Hawkins and even Cotter before him, they really built that foundation. And a lot of that's when Dan Hawkins, feel the Hawk love, like all of this, his famous kind of Zen approach to college football. But then he got to Colorado. Things didn't quite go as well as they had hoped. And as they've all found out, it could get quite worse. It could get a lot worse. Really, right now, we're finally seeing them climb out from what happened after they let go of Dan Hawkins. But again, so he was there and Cody Hawkins was his quarterback. But now, and Dan Hawkins has just retired. He was in TV for a while and then came back to coach his alma mater, UC Davis, just outside Sacramento. And he was there and doing pretty well, getting the Aggies into the playoffs here in several years. But then this past season, Cody Hawkins, his son, was the head coach of Idaho State. So we had a wonderful moment where the head coaches of two rival conference teams were father and son. And certainly we've had that before. We mentioned them at the outset, but Bobby and Tommy played each other in the Bowden Bowl for a number of years there at Florida State versus Clemson in the ACC. But I just thought I'd mention the Hawkins family because, again, just kind of broadening it. And while, again, this is going to be Cody's second year as the head coach of Idaho State, there's something charming about that. And I just wanted to mention that kind of, especially now that Dan has retired, and he did win the game they played this season. It is sort of charming to see that kind of relationship.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So I'm going to stick on the player side again, and I'm going to go to probably one of the most notable football families that we have. I'm going to go with the Matthews family, but more specifically, I'm going to go with Bruce Matthews and Jake Matthews as the father-son duo. Two all-time great offensive linemen. Bruce Matthews considered like an Iron Man in the NFL, played a lot of different positions, but was also a consensus All-American, was also two-time All-Pac-10 at the time, won the Morris Trophy that year. And Jake Matthews, I think that you can make the case, was also one of the great offensive linemen of the past couple of years. A unanimous All-American in 2013, two-time first-team All-American, two-time first-team All-SEC, was the sixth pick in the 2014 NFL Draft. Didn't end up being maybe quite the all-time player that people expected at the NFL level, but has been a mainstay, has played for a long time, and there's a couple more that came through as well. Like Kevin Matthews also played at Texas A&M, Luke Matthews, Mike Matthews. So like this father-son combo has done quite a bit. And this is also, by the way, the same family as the Clay Matthews family, as in like the edge rusher who played for the Packers, Clay Matthews Jr., Clay Matthews Sr. before him. Clay Matthews Sr. was kind of like the originator. He was a player a very long time ago. But if you really want to talk about it, I mean, yeah, it's Clay Matthews Sr. to Bruce Matthews to Jake Matthews, including Clay Matthews Jr., including Clay Matthews III. So, I mean, the Matthews family runs deep, probably as deep as any family in college football, and I think they deserve to be on this list.
I like that inclusion, and Clay Matthews III is the best example of someone who was led on a team as a walk-on based on just the family connections and just the sort of general belief that he should develop into someone good. And I remember because he was a walk-on at USC, and then suddenly he got his way into the starting lineup, and suddenly he was like an NFL draft pick, and then he was later a hair model along with his former teammate Troy Polamalu. They weren't teammates, but other fellow USC alum Troy Polamalu for hair products because of their lovely manes. Yeah, absolutely. I love that pick. So I'm going to go again with head coaches. And this is these are a family of head coaches where all three of them were coaches, the father and the two sons, but not one of them is still prominent and is probably going to end up being a head coach again, depending on where and when, is going to be a loaded question. But that's the Petrino family, because Bob Petrino Sr., which is Bobby Petrino's dad, so he went by Bob Petrino Sr. He passed away only not that long ago, in 2018. He was a head coach at an NAIA school, Carroll, out in Montana. And both his sons were quarterbacks for Carroll. Bobby and Paul are actually a little bit farther apart in years. They're about 6 years apart in age. And so Bobby, of course, became a head coach at multiple teams, including a brief NFL stint. But, Louisville, Arkansas, Missouri State. Obviously last year he was the offensive coordinator for Jimbo's last season at A&M, and now he is in case of emergency break class. Pardon me. I mean, he's offensive coordinator at Arkansas again. And then Paul Petrino, who for the longest time was coaching with his brother for a while there, was actually the head coach of Idaho he got handed a bad situation, because for those who don't know, he was named the head coach of Idaho, and then Idaho quickly announces that we're going to go down to the FCS level after the Sun Belt had pushed them out. So I remember being at those really awkward Sun Belt media days where, everyone wanted to it was also awkward because they would have it in New Orleans. So not a lot of the Idaho media would make it down to cover, Idaho's media day out in New Orleans in the Superdome. So people would just kind of want to ask him questions. Everyone, you could tell, wanted to ask him, what's the situation now that you're losing scholarships and you have to recruit people to a team that's not even going to be in FBS anymore? And I just remember he gave a look where you remember the human really quickly, because he gave a look like, come on, man. What do you expect me to say in this situation? He didn't say that, but it just conveyed I am stuck with this situation. I'm going to make the best deal out of it. And I admire anybody who can do that. And to be fair, they were doing pretty well when they moved down to FCS for a couple of seasons there under Paul. And now he's no longer the head coach, but again, the Petrino family is notable. And again, another one of those examples of, as I was talking about, some of these dynasties come out of that Northwest, Big Mountain, Big Sky region. And I wanted to mention him as well. A quick side note to that, because I don't think he necessarily deserves to be mentioned on the same level of father-son royalty, but Dennis Erickson's also a guy from out there, because he played at Montana State, obviously won at many different levels. He was an NFL head coach, was a college head coach in the true journeyman sense at so many different departments, but has also won a national championship when he was obviously at Miami. And then his son Bryce is also a college assistant right now. So I just wanted to throw the Ericksons out there too, but also an example of at least the paterfamilias was way out in Montana, out in that way. So I thought I'd mention those two, at least particularly the Petrinos, because of their relevancy.
No, I mean, and one thing that I'll mention too, this isn't necessarily a note about fathers and sons, but I think that sort of Northwestern culture, it's really starting to permeate a little bit, right? I mean, Kalen DeBoer obviously comes from South Dakota. You see the success that South Dakota State's had. You've seen the assistants that have come through North Dakota State, like a Chris Kleiman. There's some really good football being played out there, and they do things a certain way, a little bit of an old school way. But I think I think you even see Matt Entz, the former North Dakota State head coach, hired at USC because they want to get a little piece of that as well on the defensive side of the ball. So I think that you're right. And the other part too is that while there's a lot of pressure to win, of course, I mean, Matt Entz just left because he only won a national championship. I think that there's also, I don't want to say a patience, but you can build something out there. I think that you can do things your way. You can build a culture. I think that one thing that helps, I got to talk to Jonathan Smith when he was at Oregon State a little bit about this, is when you're out there, what you do is football, man. And you can kind of bring in guys who want to be there, who want to play football, who want to do things the right way. And so I think that you're right. It's notable, the sort of Northwestern culture that you see out here, in a way that I don't think that people talk about enough.
One other name I wanted to throw out there, and he was in the back of my list, not someone I was going to, but also just kind of continuing this Big Sky country, is Sonny Lubick, who some people may remember as was the coach of Colorado State for many, many years. He went to Western Montana, And then both his sons are currently, I believe, assistants at college and NFL level, Matt Lubick and Mark Lubick. And Matt played for Western Montana as well, and Mark played for Montana State. So again, you just see this disproportionate influence of these. I guess you could say they're in that footprint up there. And it's fascinating, particularly considering how sparsely populated we're talking about. The heft of the head coaches out there is some. I mean, you can even talk about. I believe Carroll. I don't know where. I mean, we're talking about that small Montana school, Carroll. I don't remember when he was there, but John, was it Garibaldi, the guy who was St. John's head coach, the D3 school that had like the ridiculous number of wins. Like he broke the record at one point. He also was at a Carroll as well. At least that was his previous spot before he took the St. John's job and stayed there for like decades upon decades, which put him up there in that same Halcyon group with Bowden and Paterno and Eddie Robinson, the guys who had been at head coaches for so long and were inseparable from the teams that they were associated with.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, let's run through a little quicker. We've obviously spent a lot of time on these first 7. So my next one, I'm gonna go with the rare player administrator combination. The other guy was also a player, but better known as an administrator. I'm gonna go with Oliver and Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck, of course, a Heisman finalist. I think 2 years in a row he was kind of the guy who helped transform Stanford into being Stanford in a lot of ways as a player. And Oliver Luck has been a long-time administrator. He's kind of like the first call whenever anybody runs into trouble, whether it's the Big 12, whether it's the XFL, whether it's West Virginia, whether it's anybody. And so, again, one of the most well-respected administrators, I think you could say. Anytime, as somebody who's a national reporter, anytime there's an opening in college football, it doesn't really matter what it is. Oliver Luck is probably going to get mentioned for that role, no matter what. He was commissioner of the XFL. He was an EVP with the NCAA. He worked for the Houston Sports Authority for a couple of years, which was when Andrew Luck was growing up. He was athletic director at West Virginia for a couple of years. So, like, he's very well respected, and he also was a good player. He's in the West Virginia Sports Hall of Fame as well, and was on the 1980s West Virginia team. So I think that Oliver and Andrew Luck, a combo that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I just to kind of keep this moving, there's a pair of family coaches that have been in the news, and they're because of the University of Washington, because Jed Fish has hired 2 dynastic coaching families, the second generation, the next generation, to be part of his staff. And that's, of course, Steve Belichick's son. Actually, pardon me, not Steve. Oh, my goodness. Actually, yes, it is Steve. I forgot. He's probably named after his grandfather. You have the Belichick family, because Steve Belichick was actually who passed away, 1919 to 2005. The father of Bill Belichick actually was briefly a college head coach at Hiram, which is a small college that still plays I believe D2 football out in the East Coast. But Bill Belichick, the legend, obviously we all know who he is. He was with the Patriots up until recently. His son, Steven, who has also been a head coach and a coordinator, was just hired as Washington's defensive coordinator. And that's an exciting hire. It's an interesting hire. And that's a rare grandson who's now clearly rising up in the coaching field, because a P5 coordinator position is not, especially the reigning national champion runner-up, is nothing to denigrate. And his brother, Brian, has also been an assistant in the NFL as well. And then on the other side of the ball, of course, Pete Carroll, we know who he is. His son, Brennan Carroll, was hired to be the OC at Washington. And during this recent coaching carousel, Brennan's name kept popping up as a potential head coach for a couple of different positions. So again, those are 2 sons of Super Bowl winning head coaches. And in the case of Pete Carroll, national championship at the college level. And, you cannot, his run at USC was just something else. So we have 2 sons that have come from excellent families and are now going to be on both sides of the ball as coordinators at Washington. And again, since we're also mentioning brothers, Nate Carroll has also been was an assistant with the Seahawks under his father, Pete, who was also, just like Bill, let go this past season. So I wanted to do those 2 because, again, while we certainly have 2, again, both of them are currently P5 coordinators, so they're on the rise, and they deserve mention as kind of this this growth and hitting two birds with one stone.
And by the way, Bill Belichick's godfather is College Football Hall of Fame coach Bill Edwards, who is actually who he was named after, a coach at Vanderbilt and at Wittenberg. So how about that? I think that factors in at least a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go with an athletic director family next. I'm going to go with former Duke athletic director Kevin White and his son, now Tennessee athletic director Danny White. And Danny White's tenure has been a little shorter, of course, because he's a little bit of a younger guy. But I think he's already made quite the name for himself. He was the athletic director when Buffalo kind of transitioned up a little bit. He was the athletic director when UCF had their great run of success. He claimed a national championship for them back in 2017, which certainly got some attention, I think you could say. And then at Tennessee, I think that he deserves a lot of credit, of course, for hiring Josh Heupel, who's done a good job. But more than anything, I think that he deserves a lot of credit for formalizing and professionalizing their NIL process at a time that most other places were not doing that. And I think you see some of the success they're having on the field and on the recruiting trail right now. I think Danny White deserves a lot of credit for that. And, Kevin White, again, one of these athletic directors who's just incredibly well respected, was a longtime athletic director, started at Loras, went to Maine, Tulane, Arizona State, Notre Dame, and then ended his career at Duke. Somebody who's an all-time type athletic director as well. So not very many pure athletic director families on our list, but I think that Kevin and Danny White deserve to be among them.
I like that selection. Now I am going to go with again, I want to keep my I have so many in my back pocket right now. I'm going to go with a couple of sets of brothers because I think they're both influential in what they've done in college coaching right now. And they don't have a father, though, in all of this. And that is Lincoln and Garrett Riley. Two strong coaches. Obviously, Lincoln Riley, Oklahoma, current USC head coach. Garrett Riley has been rising up. He's currently obviously also a college assistant in college football, and not just an afterthought. He is a serious assistant in college football right now. And then the Brom family, because Jeff Brom, excellent quarterback, and then has been the head coach at Western Kentucky, Purdue, and Louisville. And Brian Brom was a quarterback of note. I remember when he was playing, and is also currently an assistant. So I wanted to mention those two as kind of families on the rise. And while I'm at it, why don't I bring up one other one? Although there is a dad involved here. Kim Helton was a Houston head coach at one point. His two sons are Clay Helton, the current head coach of Georgia Southern and previously USC, and the current Western Kentucky head coach, Tyson Helton. So that's another family I want to throw out there of current head coaches that are a familial relationship, in addition to the sets of brothers out there. But that's always exciting. I always love it when you see brothers who both made that work out.
So we'll just call that the USC group then, because of the Heltons and the Rileys. I think that one that I'd be remiss not to mention, just being a Texan, would be Kevin Murray and Kyler Murray. Kevin Murray, considered one of the better quarterbacks at Texas A&M before it's kind of 2000. He was a Southwest Conference Player of the Year. I believe he was the Southwest Conference's all-time touchdown leader whenever he played there, and I think he might have ended that way as well. And that Kyler Murray kid, pretty good at football. Obviously wins a Heisman Trophy in his one full year as a starting quarterback. He was number 1 in the NFL draft. He also, by the way, again, his dad was a Texas A&M Aggie. He started his career as a Texas A&M Aggie. His recruitment was so funny. The last week before he ended up signing with Texas A&M, he went on an official visit to Texas and tweeted out a picture of a jersey with Murray on the back, like he was going to flip to Texas, then ends up signing at Texas A&M and then transfers to Texas' other rival, Oklahoma, and terrorizes them somewhere completely different. So a really great football family, one of the best football families in terms of quarterbacks in the state of Texas of the last little while.
I like that one, but if we're talking Texas, so we should also mention Spike Dykes and Sonny Dykes, because there's a good one too.
Yeah.
Spike Dykes, obviously, for many years at Texas Tech, and Sonny, obviously, he went to several different head coaching jobs, but he obviously played for Texas Tech in his young days. Louisiana Tech, Cal, which is still one of the funniest tenures when you think back of what they could have done with the person they actually had as their head coach. SMU, and then, of course, TCU, where in his first season he was the national championship runner-up. I think those two are also a pair of head coaches that deserve mention, particularly with those Texas roots.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great pick. That was potentially who I was going to go with my last pick. So this is my 10th and final pick, but a lot of honorable mentions. We'll get to them in just a second. What direction do I go here? This is a good question. I mean, this is my last pick. You've already made all your picks, so I'm gonna think out loud just for a second. So we've got one that came to mind was Jerry Rice and Brendan Rice, the wide receiver at USC, obviously the all-time greatest receiver in the history of football on the other side, and a great player at Missouri Valley. Another one that came to mind for me was Frank Gore Sr. and Jr. Frank Gore Jr. ended up being an awesome player this year, but Frank Gore Sr. wasn't like an elite level player at the college level. He was very good, but he ended up being an even better NFL player. But he was a member, by the way, of Miami's national championship team in 2001. I think I'm going to end up going a different direction. I'm going to go with Bobby Humphrey and Marlon Humphrey. Marlon Humphrey, of course, a cornerback at Alabama back during the Saban run. Bobby Humphrey was a running back for them in the 90s. And at the time, he was actually the all-time leading rusher in the history of Alabama. He ended up entering the draft as a supplemental pick and went in the first round. So, I mean, again, two all-time Alabama players who both played. I actually have to think for a second. Did Bobby Humphrey play for the national championship team? Because Marlon Humphrey won a national championship during his time there. I don't believe so. No, he was right before. He entered the supplemental draft in 1989. Of course, Alabama wins in 1992. But he was a two-time All-American. He rushed for a whole bunch of yards during his time at Alabama as well. And then Marlon Humphrey, part of one of those great secondaries. I think that you could make the case. We made the All-Saban team a couple of weeks ago, and the combination of Marlon Humphrey and Minkah Fitzpatrick, I mean, that might be the best combo in the secondary of the Nick Saban era. So I think that they're a good way to round out the list. With that said, who are your honorable mentions who didn't quite make the cuts?
I cannot wait to go through these because there's some names where when I looked at who I didn't mention, I kind of feel embarrassed. But I'm gonna go through one that is, we talked about it before because the father wasn't necessarily known as a college coach, although he had technically had a head coaching spot, and that was the Kiffins, because Monty Kiffin did actually coach North Carolina State as head coach for a while, and obviously Lane Kiffin, very well known, both college and briefly in the NFL as well. And Chris has been a successful assistant coach as well. I also had Yurachek's, because Hunter Yurachek, the current athletic director at Arkansas, previously at Houston, previously at Coastal, his children are younger. I think that's part of the reason why I didn't bring him up. But Ryan played college. I remember he was a tight end at Marshall. He's now an offensive analyst at South Carolina. Jake is now also an administrator at SMU, where he's helping, I believe, in development. And his youngest son, Brooks, I think is still playing college football. I think he's a linebacker at Wake Forest right now. The Beamers, Frank Beamer and Shane Beamer. I mean, we have to mention them when you're talking about people, especially the sheer impact that Frank had at Virginia Tech, making them an absolute factor. You know, on the nepotism, okay, not total nepotism, but you have to mention the Ferences because they've been in the news so much. Obviously, Kirk has been a dominating force at Iowa. It's hard to overstate how much of an impact he's had there, just where Iowa was and where they are now. But of course, Brian Ferentz had some we're going to see where he goes. I'm sure he's still got a bright future ahead of him. And then his other son, James, was a decent football player in and of himself, and he's still playing in the NFL as far as I know. And then you have the Lynn family, Anthony Lynn, who was the Chargers head coach. His son is a very promising rising coordinator, because last season, Danton Lynn was the defensive coordinator under Chip Kelly at UCLA. USC was so desperate for a great coach, they hired him. They hired the Rivals defensive coordinator. So that's another one. We never mentioned Lou Holtz and Skip Holtz. There's another father-son combination. Lou Holtz was phenomenal as a college head coach. Obviously, Notre Dame is what he's best known for, winning a national championship there. But at Minnesota, Arkansas, NC State, William and Mary, and South Carolina, trying to bring that program out of the pit it was in. I always forget he was like a head coach in the NFL for like one season. And then Skip, obviously he had his own stops as well at South Florida and Louisiana Tech. He's now, I believe, in one of those spring football leagues. He's currently a head coach there after he was let go by Louisiana Tech. And we're speaking of South Carolina, although he's not as well known for being a South Carolina coach, the old ball coach Steve Spurrier, obviously won Heisman as a player there, was a head coach there, NFL briefly, back to South Carolina, and his son Steve Spurrier Jr. is a college assistant currently, and Scott Spurrier is also a college assistant. I also had, goodness, there's so many people I had here. Rich Stockstill, who was finally let go at Middle Tennessee. His son Brent played for him for many years and is a college assistant. On the controversial side, I have to still mention him, Art Briles. You have to mention Art Briles because Kendall Briles is still a very highly regarded coordinator. And his son-in-law is, of course, Jeff Lebby, who was at Oklahoma last season as their coordinator, is now the head coach of Mississippi State. My goodness, I could keep going, but those are some of my honorary mentions.
All right. I love that list. I think that a lot of those make sense, several of which were on my list as well. I'm going to mention Jim Tressel and Mike Tressel. Mike Tressel, now a very well-respected defensive coordinator under Luke Fickell at Cincinnati and Wisconsin. I'm also going to mention Dominic Raiola and now Dylan Raiola.
I like that one.
We're a little early on Dylan Raiola. He hasn't yet played college football, but I think that he is a game-changing enough recruit that, like I mentioned, Arch with the Mannings, I think that the combination of Dominic and Dylan Raiola is one to mention. You did mention Pete and Brennan Carroll, but that's one that I wanted to bring up. Brennan, I think, is an up-and-comer in this industry right now. Like I mentioned, Frank Gore and Frank Gore Jr. Frank Gore Jr., by the way, won MVP of the Shrine Bowl just a couple of weeks ago, and actually, Frank Gore Sr. was there filming on his iPhone, like of him getting awarded. And I'm like, man, I think that somebody will get that for you. Don't worry about that. And I do want to emphasize again. You mentioned Sonny Dykes and Spike Dykes, one of the first families of coaching in Texas. The funny thing was that Sonny went to Texas Tech, where Spike was a coach, and did not play football. He actually played baseball during his time at Texas Tech. He didn't want to play football over there, but he did eventually stick around as a coach. He coached high school ball. He ended up joining Mike Leach's staff as, I believe it was, inside receivers coach, and worked his way up, did a really good job. And I think that you mentioned it a little bit before. Sonny, I think, got a really bad rap because of how Cal went. And I think that he's proven time and time again that he's just a good football coach. Although he's got to figure out what the hell just happened during his most recent year at TCU. But I have a lot of faith that he's going to figure something out. So strong list. I'm going to run through our official top 10s each real quick. At number 1 for you, House Harbaugh, Jim and Jack and John Harbaugh and Jay Harbaugh now. The Bowdens, the Stoopses, the Fritzes, the Karras family of Mount Union fame, the Hawkins family. It's a weaker pick for me, but that's all right. The Petrino family, the Belichicks, led by not just Bill, but 2 generations of Stevens. The Riley and Heltons, which again, I think it's kind of fun to tie both of those USC ties in there, and the Dykes family, Spike and Sonny. For me, I went a little more player heavy. I went with the Mannings, Archie, Peyton, and Eli, and now Arch coming through. The Sanders family, Dion, Shiloh, and Shador Sanders. The McCaffreys, Ed, Christian, and Luke. The Greaseys, Bob and Brian. Marvin Harrison Sr. and Jr. The entire Matthews family, which there's a lot. Oliver and Andrew Luck. Kevin and Danny White as administrators, Kevin and Kyler Murray as Texas A&M turned Oklahoma legends, and the Humphrey family, Marlon and his father, Bobby. So a lot of really great people. And I mean, there's so many guys we didn't mention. Like Joe Alt's dad was a great college football player. I mean, there were just so many guys.
Morris,
Chris Henry.
you have a head coach, an NFL head coach, and Jim Morris still coaching.
Yeah.
Jim L. I always forget they're not junior and senior. One has an E, one has an L. The McIntyres, George McIntyre was the head coach of Vandy, and Mike McIntyre was San Jose State, Colorado, and now FIU. I mean, there were so many. Like a lot of people want to be like their dad, and I'll just say that. I mean, again, I don't want to do the nepotism angle. I just say a lot of people see what their parents do and they want to do it, and I love that.
Yeah, and one other that I'll mention, just because I have a local tie to them, is the head coach at my high school. Whenever I first entered high school, was Bob Shipley, and his sons were Jordan Shipley, who played with Colt McCoy, and Jackson Shipley, who played a couple years after that. And then Bob actually ended up at staff on Texas for a couple years too. So I can make the father-son connection, even if it's a little tenuous. So let's throw the Shipleys under consideration too.
I love it. I remember Jordan Shipley as a player. Absolutely.
Well, yeah, he played for like 8 years. How could you not remember him?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think that's a good spot to wrap this up. Thanks for joining us again, Shehan. I mean, I made it sound like you're a guest, but I mean, I can't wait to have you back more full time once you've had a chance to enjoy and savor these wonderful early points of fatherhood. It's a delight. They don't come back. They pass. As I say, they pass slowly when they're happening, but then you look back and you realize they just flew by. So savor every second of it. Savor the joy. Eventually, because I know she's a little young, and when she starts smiling, that's when it's going to really melt your heart. That's when you're going to it's going to just slay you inside. It's an incredible feeling, a wonderful feeling. And man, that's wonderful. Congratulations again to you and your wife on having a family together. That's great. But we'll wrap this one up here. I just wanted to thank all of you who are listening to us. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. And be sure, if you get a chance, like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. And I'm Bobak Hyeri. Thanks for listening. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.